For 40 years, humans haven't left Earth orbit since our last trip to the moon in 1972. In that time, we perfected the art of circling the Earth with vehicles like the Space Shuttle and the Space Station. Only our robots have been boldly going beyond the reaches of Earth's gravity, exploring our solar system and landing on other planets. But change is in the air. Humans could soon be voyaging to destinations beyond Earth orbit. And that unleashes a whole new set of challenges.
Exploration changes dramatically when you move from that which is performed by robots to that where humans are involved.
Robots do not have to be cared for in the same way. Quite frankly, Curiosity on Mars is not coming home. He is on a suicide mission. And that's okay. But we would never do that with astronauts.
This is the story of the formidable new spacecraft NASA is building to send us, its most fragile cargo, farther than we've ever gone before, and bring us back again. The technological breakthroughs behind NASA's great manned missions of the past have now given us the blueprints to achieve these incredible 21st century goals. The most powerful ever manned rocket that will take us back to the moon and then voyage far beyond it. A robust, state-of-the-art crew capsule to keep our astronauts alive for years as they explore our solar system. And a radical new landing module which can take humans on and off many asteroids and planets during the course of a single voyage.
We know how to do it, but it is a very, very ambitious goal. I think we can do it, though.
NASA is no stranger to challenges. Back in the 1960s, space was a battleground in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. Russia took the lead with Yuri Gagarin's first manned spaceflight in 1961. America's answer was Project Apollo.
The object of Apollo was to go to the moon and demonstrate that American technology and American engineering and American scientific knowledge was superior to that of our rivals, the Soviet Union.
At this point, no human had ever left low Earth orbit, 1,200 miles above our planet. Now NASA had to work out how to propel an extra 80,000 pounds of men, machines, food, and fuel nearly 250,000 miles farther and bring them home again.
We needed a major rocket, a super rocket, if you will. The most we had at that time were the ICBMs, the Atlas, and the Titan. But you needed something much bigger with much more thrust in order to get to the moon. And that was the development of the Saturn V.
With this vehicle, the flight to the moon will be accomplished. The Saturn V is taller than the Statue of Liberty.
Any rocket is basically just an aerodynamic fuel tank. The bigger the rocket, the more fuel, thrust, and distance. And the Saturn V was the biggest rocket ever built, packed with technological muscle.
The first stage produces a total thrust of 7.5 million pounds.
A powerful new engine was designed to generate this huge thrust, the F1.
The F1 engine at the bottom of the first stage of the Saturn V generated much more power than any rocket engine ever before or since.
But there was a problem. Each of the 5 F1 engines needed a large combustion chamber to create this thrust. And the larger the chamber, the greater the risk of combustion instability, which could literally rip the rocket thrusters apart. No human crew would survive the explosion. The Soviets faced the same problem with their N-1 moon rocket and tried to solve it in a different way.
They instead used 30 much smaller engines, and they could never get them to work as a unit. And that was ultimately one of the failures of their N-1 moon rocket and why they never got to the moon themselves.
The solution lay in changing the angle of fuel merger in the combustion chamber. Finally, they had the engine that could lift the Saturn V off the Earth. Next, they needed a new engine to take the astronauts from there to the moon. The answer was the J-2.
The J-2 engine, that is the world's only large engine to ever be restarted in space.
The J-2 was the largest engine ever designed to stop and be reignited in space. Crucially, this allowed a spacecraft coasting in Earth orbit to accelerate beyond it to the moon. It was the breakthrough NASA needed. But the Soviets were right on America's heels. So, in a risky move, the Saturn V was test launched just twice before NASA put 3 men on top of it for humanity's first journey to the moon, Apollo 8.
First time you do anything, it's bound to be risky, don't you think? We had never left Earth orbit. We had never spent 3 days navigating to the moon. We had never fired a rocket in deep space. We had never gone into orbit around another planet.
Apollo 8 astronauts Frank Borman, Bill Anders, and Jim Lovell are well aware of the risk they're taking.
The chances of coming back, I thought they were a little bit better than 50-50.
Early morning, December 21, 1968. It's the moment of truth for the Saturn V and NASA.
From the inside of the capsule is a lot different than watching the launch from outside as an observer. Inside the spacecraft, very, very quiet. Very, very quiet. And about 5 or 6 seconds before launch, we could hear the fuel starting to rumble down into the engines, and then we could hear the engines start.
5, 4, 3, 2, launch commit, liftoff.
There's a great shaking and a rocking as the vehicle takes off.
The Saturn V's force is literally breathtaking.
7 million pounds of thrust, burning 8,000 pounds of propellant per second. The turbine is spinning up at 20,000 revolutions per minute.
My shirt is beating and it's pounding me like this, and my chain is jingling in my pocket. Now that was what the sound waves did, rolling into you.
Saturn V's kerosene-powered F-1 engines thrust the astronauts 42 miles towards space in only 2 minutes.
As you take off, it's very slow. So actually, there's not much of a force back in the seat. It goes faster and faster and faster, and you're pulled back more and more.
By the time the first stage has burned out its fuel, the Saturn V, the size of a Navy destroyer, is moving at 7 times the speed of sound.
You're pressed into the seat about 4 Gs, 4 times your normal weight. And then suddenly, the engines stop and you go forward, and then the second stage lights.
Good ignition on the second stage.
Stage 2 continues upwards for 6 more minutes using J-2 rockets. And then Stage 3, also J-2 powered, takes Apollo 8 to a height of 118 miles. The crew are now in Earth orbit. Then, at around 9:40 a.m. in Houston, Apollo 8 is ordered to reignite its Stage 3 J-2 engine and shoot for the moon. Accelerating to 23,000 miles per hour, the 3 men on board Apollo 8 become the first human beings to leave Earth orbit. The crew settles in for a 3-day journey to the moon.
We saw nothing at all as we approached the moon until we rolled the spacecraft 180 degrees, and then we looked down and there was the surface, about 60 miles below.
69 hours into the mission, the astronauts become the first people to set eyes on the far side of the moon.
We were like 3 school kids looking into a candy store window. Forgot the flight plan right away, nose pressed to the window and looking at those craters going by. It's stark and sort of forbidden.
As the crew first round the moon, they get the biggest surprise of the mission, perhaps of the entire Apollo program.
The first thing we saw, of course, was the Earth. Probably the most impressive sight the three of us had looked at. We all said we ought to take a picture of this thing, and Bill had the color camera.
Bill Anders' photo Earthrise would become an iconic image from the 20th century, adorning posters and book covers as a symbol of our small, fragile planet hanging alone in an endless vacuum.
The one image that they took of Earthrise is one of the most compelling pictures made throughout human history. It really did signal to us, this is our home. We are indeed living on a little ship ourselves, a little spaceship. We need to undertake actions to preserve this planet as our abode.
The photo is credited with inspiring a nascent environmental movement.
The Earth, in reality, if you put your thumb up, you can hide it. And you have to think about that for a while. If you can hide the Earth behind your thumb, then everything you ever knew, existence and livelihood and all your loved ones and all the problems that the Earth has is behind your thumb. How insignificant we really all are.
As Apollo 8 continues their orbit around the moon on Christmas Eve, they broadcast a carefully selected reading to those back on Earth.
1968 had been a bad year in our country. Lots of stuff, bad stuff had happened. We had 2 assassinations, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, riots at the Chicago Convention. There was a lot of reaction to the Vietnam War, and all this stuff was sort of boiling. And then on Christmas Eve, the crew is in orbit around the moon, and they come on and read from Genesis.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light.
It was the most watched broadcast of the time.
It was an extremely moving thing. Human beings away from the Earth, way out here by themselves, Christmas Eve, reading from the Bible, and it was very powerful.
Apollo 8 orbits the moon 10 times. They see the sun rise and set every 2 hours. But the riskiest maneuver of the mission lies ahead, the trans-Earth injection. The crew must ignite the 20,000-pound thrust of their service propulsion engine for 203 seconds to send Apollo 8 on a trajectory back to our planet. If anything goes wrong, the crew will be left orbiting the moon for eternity. Seasoned Mission Control Director Chris Kraft has witnessed 16 manned missions and knows the knife edge the crew is on.
I don't believe I've ever been that concerned, that worried in the whole time of the space program. When that thing disappeared on the backside of the moon, they had to fire that rocket very precisely in order to get back to the Earth. That was the longest 30 minutes of my life.
Mission Control must wait through 30 minutes of radio blackout to find out if the burn has worked.
Engines started. As we came around, we knew that we were on our way home.
Roger. Please be informed there is a Santa Claus.
Jim Lovell said, "There really is a Santa Claus." He was right.
Apollo 8's final rocket works exactly as planned. The spacecraft speeds back toward home. But 3 days later, another life-threatening ordeal lies ahead. For the first time ever, a crew must re-enter the Earth's atmosphere from deep space at 24,000 miles per hour, more than 6,000 miles per hour faster than any previous re-entry.
You know, you think of the atmosphere as this thin thing, but if you hit it the wrong angle, it'd be like doing a belly flop from the high diving board into a swimming pool or something. You don't want to do that. But if you go too shallow, you bounce off and head off into deep space and nobody will ever see you again. So Apollo 8 had to come back in this very, very narrow corridor a little wedge a few degrees wide, and they had to withstand the heat.
The temperature of the heat shield's higher than the surface of the sun. So that's the reason we came in, skipped out to kill off part of the energy, and then come back in again.
It starts to glow before we feel anything. Then we see flakes of the heat shield coming off as sparks as we come on in.
But the command module's heat shield holds up. The crews splash down safely in the Pacific Ocean near Christmas Island.
Fantastic adventure and fantastic results in the Apollo program. It was the key, no question about it. And it took a lot of guts to do what we did.
Apollo 8 is a technical tour de force from start to finish, forging important milestones for human space travel. The first rocket fired in deep space. The first time we'd navigated a manned spaceship to orbit another world. In other words, the first time we had truly left Earth. And none of it would have been possible without the bravery of Apollo's crew and the muscular might of the Saturn V.
You can thank Saturn V for enabling humankind to prove that we can go to another celestial body, land safely, and return safely.
In 1972, a Saturn V carried humans to the moon for the last time. Now, 40 years later, NASA wants to get people back into deep space. And this time, the moon is just one of the stops on a very ambitious space itinerary. The first stop, a lunar flyby in the 2020s, followed by an attempt to rendezvous with one of the 9,000 near-Earth asteroids.
We know that there's a lot to be learned by bringing back a soil sample, for example, from an asteroid. We've got teams looking at how we would perform that mission.
We have asteroids that come near this particular planet on a pretty regular basis, and we might be able to go out and land a vehicle on it, maybe mine it even.
The next stop could be a Lagrange point, an amazing place 1 million miles from home, where the gravitational pull between the Earth, Moon, and Sun reach equilibrium, essentially enabling spacecraft to park there.
Once you get to a Lagrange point, you can go almost anywhere with very little fuel. So if you build a station there, it sort of becomes a real base camp in space that can have a lot of practical uses.
And finally, astronauts could begin exploring other planets by the 2030s. Mars is first on the list. A mission of such scale and ambition, it makes a trip to the moon look easy.
The moon is only days away. Mars is a much further place, a much harder proposition, and so a challenge to go to Mars is, to me, one of the greatest challenges we can imagine in space exploration.
Yet again, NASA needs to build a rocket with enough thrust to send humans and all our survival needs into deep space. The Saturn V had just one target, but the new rocket needs to travel to a number of different destinations, all in the same mission, and to get farther, faster. NASA's solution is the Space Launch System, or SLS. Fully formed, it will stand at 403 feet, 40 feet taller than the Saturn V, firing 2 million pounds more thrust, and capable of lifting 130 tons, or 75 SUVs, into space.
The new rocket looks like it's going to be great. It'd be good to get back to that kind of vehicle that can expand in size and lift more and more tonnage into space.
The SLS is a sublime hybrid, formed from the best and brightest parts of NASA's earlier rockets. Its bottom half, the first stage, uses old space shuttle parts. It's powered by 2 solid rocket boosters and 4 RS-25 engines, both key elements that launched 30 years of shuttle missions. while the SLS's top half, the eventual upper stage, stems from the Saturn V. It's powered by the J2X engines, whose ancestor, the J2, motored the Saturn V rocket from the Earth to the Moon. It won't just be the rocket that's breaking new ground. Atop the SLS will be a new generation of astronaut, riding in a new generation of space capsule. For the past 30 years, NASA has been concentrating on successfully exploring Earth orbit using the plane-like space shuttle. But now that we're heading for deep space again, NASA is going back to the future with an Apollo-like capsule design. Its official name is the Multi-Purpose Crew Vehicle, otherwise known as Orion. It's a $500 million, 24-ton spaceship, capable of carrying 4 astronauts to the Moon and beyond.
The Orion capsule is Apollo on steroids, and I'm happy to see a return to that kind of spacecraft. First off, we have an escape system. Plus, we can land anywhere, and that's a very big margin of safety.
And like Apollo, Orion has 3 fundamental elements. A launch abort system to ferry the crew to safety in case of an emergency on the pad or during ascent. A conical module to carry the crew. And finally, a service module that houses the propulsion to maneuver Orion, while the J2X propels it through space. But though Orion and its Apollo ancestor may look the same from the outside, the similarity is only skin deep.
We're not going back and building just a larger Apollo. We are building a new vehicle using all the latest technology that we've got.
Orion's interior is truly avant-garde, with computer technology unheard of in the Apollo era. The touchscreen control system is derived from a Boeing 787.
In the Apollo days, it was all analog. Lots of round dials and gauges like you might see in an automobile, for example. What we've got now is flat screen displays. Everything is computer driven, so it's all digital instead of analog.
The computer guidance system has also evolved considerably since Apollo.
When the 3 astronauts went to the Moon in the Apollo days, unfortunately one of them had to stay behind with the command module circling, orbiting the Moon. This vehicle can maintain itself autonomously in an orbit. No one has to stay behind and maintain it. It can do all that itself. That's a high-level example of how far we've come since the Apollo days.
By the summer of 1969, NASA was working at fever pitch. More than 400,000 people had been mobilized around the country with one goal: to land a man on the Moon before the end of the decade. But before launching Apollo 11 towards the goal, NASA had to sort out something potentially even more important than the landing itself.
The public relations division of NASA was very concerned about one thing: the video photography. We are talking about the video camera that will show pictures to the world. This is what people are going to see.
NASA wanted TV stations worldwide to broadcast the images in real time. But how could live images from the Moon reach the Earth?
At the time, there were no communication satellite and there were no ways of doing all kinds of things.
NASA's solution was radical. Using a series of international receiving stations in Australia, Europe, and America, similar to those they used to monitor satellites, they could continuously receive live images from the Moon, even as the Earth rotated.
So all of this network of receiving stations made it possible, and that's what really made communications of today and the television, all of these, viable today.
July 16, 1969. Nearly a decade of innovation at breakneck speed comes together for one defining mission: Apollo 11. The dreams of millions and the work of thousands are now in the hands of 3 men, led by Neil Armstrong.
Neil was clearly the most qualified test pilot with experience demonstrated experience of problem solving of anybody in the astronaut group.
Armstrong was always a quiet man. He would look and he would say, well, we'll do exactly what you want us to do. No smiles, no discussion, no comment. And Buzz Aldrin would argue with you and will say, why do we have to move from one side of the spacecraft to the next? And Michael Collins was the one that had the lighter side to him.
As the crews say their farewells to ground staff at Kennedy, Houston stands by to take over mission control when the Saturn V clears the tower.
You have a feeling of intense relief. There's no more training, there's no more reworking these procedures. We're going to launch, and we're going to go to the surface of the moon, and we're going to bring that crew back.
The sun is just beginning to come up over the horizon, and the waves are coming in, and it's so peaceful and serene. And I look out this side, and now they're just scads of people all over the place.
17 seconds and counting, guidance internal. 15,
the countdown begins.
13,
For us in the Launch Control Center, it was our moment of truth. The atmosphere, as I say, was real tight. I'm a lifetime Red Sox fan, Boston Red Sox fan, and I'm always ready for something to go wrong. But nothing went wrong that morning. It just went beautifully.
After 3 days of traveling almost 5 miles per second, the Earth is just a distant marble. The moon looms below, cold and gray. Armstrong and Aldrin enter the lunar module, separate from Collins in the command module, and approach the surface. Gene Kranz addresses his young crew in mission control.
I say, we came into this room as a team, and we will leave as a team. When these doors are locked, they will not be reopened until one of 3 things has happened. We've either landed the moon, we've crashed, or we have aborted the mission. And then all of a sudden, we get a call. Flight, we have had acquisition of signal, and now the battle begins to get the crew to the surface.
But once the crew is 50,000 feet above the surface, all mission control hears back from the lunar module is static.
Say again, 11.
Literally within seconds, we have communications problems, and that's the one thing we need in order to go down to the surface of the moon.
Mission control has to relay messages to Aldrin and Armstrong via Mike Collins in the command module.
Apollo 11, this is Houston, over.
Armstrong spins the lunar module around to see if that enables them to hear the vital message they're waiting for. Go for landing.
We finally got a lock on through all the static, and this was crucial because this is the last time that the mission control is getting data on our orbit before we start making the maneuver powered descent.
So we give the crew the go for powered descent, and just about the time we give a go, we lost communications again. So we're fighting this communications battle all the way down.
Then, at 6,000 feet above the surface, alarms ring from the lander's guidance system. The simple computer appears to be overwhelmed.
We start having these computer alarms, 1201, 1202, and I didn't have a clue really what they were.
The LEM guidance computer is too busy to get all the work done it needs to. And the key thing is to prevent these rapid sequence of these alarms where we might go to what we call program 00. And if that happens, we go to halt and the mission's over.
Fortunately, there was Steve Bales in mission control who understood the problem, understood the computer so well that he knew what that program alarm was, or he looked it up quickly, so he said, we're go on that one.
But then the lunar module starts guiding the crew to the wrong landing site. Armstrong takes manual control, seeking level ground.
We realized that Armstrong has taken over the control and he's moving the spacecraft away from the landing point. And we were all terrified. What is this? Where is he? Where is he going? What's happening? And the big bosses of NASA were looking at each other. Everybody was just bewildered.
Didn't realize that he was about to land in a boulder field. Well, it turns out the computer was off by a little bit, a mile and a half, 2 miles. Put us into a crater.
With Armstrong flying farther than planned to avoid a calamitous landing, fuel levels start dipping dangerously low.
He had to level off, fly across this boulder field, pitch up, slow down, and then start down on the final stages of descent. Well, that'd take a lot of gas. And so we were getting very low on fuel. We had a minimum for an abort. So I called Eagle 60 seconds, and he would have an abort call.
60 seconds. Lights on.
We're still 100 feet off the ground, and we got a ways to go, and I'm getting a little nervous, but I'm not about to interrupt Neil. He saw the light, he heard the command, he's in control.
And then I called Eagle 30 seconds, and now they were close, but not on the ground, so the tension was really extreme in mission control. It was, as I recall, dead silence, and everybody was glued to their monitor.
Fortunately, by the time 30 seconds came, we were about 10 feet off the ground, and I'm beginning to see a shadow. And in a few more seconds, we're picking up the dust, and then the probe coming down from the landing gear touches the ground, and it sends a signal that says contact. So I call out contact light.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
I was so excited, I couldn't even pronounce tranquility. It came out twang at first. I corrected myself and finished up tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again.
Armstrong and Aldrin touched down in the Sea of Tranquility, a basalt basin 4 miles east of their planned landing site.
For the next 2 hours, we're totally wrapped up in this business of making sure it's safe to stay on the moon, and if not, addressing the system and figuring out what are we going to do about it. The rest of the world's celebrating behind us.
6 hours after landing, Armstrong steps into his place in history.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
20 minutes later, Aldrin makes his small step.
It's not like anything here on Earth. The black sky, the stillness that you can just sense, it's not a good place to set up housekeeping.
And we're getting a picture on the TV.
600 million people around the world watched the first humans walk on the moon, the largest global television audience in history.
The Apollo 11 landing was unique in human history. Literally, everybody stopped and paid attention. It wasn't necessarily that Americans set foot on the moon. It was we humans set foot on the moon.
First time we left the Earth and landed on another solar body. And I think that's going to transpire into something in the future that will take us to Mars.
NASA is currently sending sophisticated robot systems into deep space to test different landing sites we may one day use. This information is feeding into the design of a new generation of manned landers.
We know that Mars can throw things our way, like winds or whatever, that, as you're trying to land, that could throw you off, so you try to design around that.
The new landers will be more sophisticated than anything that could have been imagined during Apollo. And this time, NASA will be working with its international partners to achieve the technological breakthroughs.
So it could be that the European Space Agency would build a lander. We may build it. That has yet to be decided.